Hello YouTube. In this video I'm going to discuss track record arguments in ethics. A track record argument for a moral theory will try to show that this moral theory has, in the past, come to what we now regard as the right conclusions, and this gives us reason to believe that the theory in question is correct. Basically, a track record argument will say that we should accept a moral theory because it has a good track record. Okay, before getting into this, quick advert. If you like my channel, you can support me on Patreon or with a one-off donation on PayPal. I offer private tutoring. Please email if you're interested, and if you want to talk about any of this stuff, join the Discord. Okay then, so track record arguments have not received much attention in the academic literature. In fact, I couldn't find any academic papers on this at all. My attention was drawn to these arguments by a blog post by Thomas Herrock titled "The Worst Argument for Utilitarianism." He quotes the philosopher William MacAskill, who gives a very nice summary of the track record argument. So here's what MacAskill says. He says, "When you look at scientific theories, you decide whether they're good or not by the predictions they made. We can do the same, to some extent, with moral theories as well. For example, we can look at the predictions, the bold claims that were going against common sense at the time that Bentham and Mill made. Compare it to the predictions, the bold moral claims that Kant made. When you look at Bentham and Mill, they were extremely progressive. They campaigned and argued for women's right to vote and the importance of women getting a good education. They were very positive on sexual liberal attitudes. In fact, some of Bentham's writings on the topic were so controversial, they weren't even published 200 years later." So, the idea is fairly straightforward, I think. When we look at the utilitarians from previous centuries, they defended what we now recognise as very forward-thinking views. Views which, at the time, were considered outrageous, but which have since become widely accepted. Jeremy Bentham defended the abolition of slavery, abolition of capital punishment, decriminalisation of homosexuality, animal rights. He arrived at these positions as a result of applying utilitarian principles. Similarly, John Stuart Mill defended gender equality. He was one of the first members of Parliament in Britain to support the right of women to vote. He defended slavery abolition, universal access to education. You can find similar progressive ideas in other early utilitarians like William Godwin, Henry Sidgwick, Bernard Bolzano. So the bold claims that were defended by these early utilitarians have now become widely accepted. Okay, now compare this to the bold claims defended in other traditions. For most of his life, Kant held extremely racist and sexist views. He argued that masturbation was seriously wrong, an even greater wrong than suicide. He argued that lying is always wrong, even if you're lying to a Nazi who is hunting for a Jewish person you have hidden in your basement. He argued that organ donation was always wrong, and indeed that giving away any body part for money was wrong. He said that even cutting your hair and selling it, that's not entirely blameless. He argued that children born outside of wedlock are born outside the law, and therefore it's legitimate for society to ignore their well-being. I'm not sure that Kant made any bold claims that have subsequently become widely accepted. He was wrong about a lot of stuff. So one way to frame this argument is in terms of predictions. We judge scientific theories on the basis of whether they make correct predictions. A scientific theory with a track record of correct predictions is a good theory. The same kind of approach can be applied to moral theories. A theory which has a track record of making surprising moral claims that subsequently come to be accepted, that's a good theory. So in general, we have some theory T, we derive some novel prediction O, and then we check and see whether or not O is true. If O turns out to be true, this supports T over the rival theories that make different predictions. In this respect, utilitarianism has the best track record. Maybe a slightly different way to think about the track record argument is that a moral theory might do kind of better than another theory in terms of kind of overcoming biases, right? So utilitarianism has proved particularly effective at helping people to see past what we now recognize as unjustified biases. So you know, it was commonly believed in the past that sexual orientation was morally relevant or reflected poorly on a person's moral character. That's now recognised as an unjust bias. We used to think that gender was morally relevant. Again, that's an unjust bias. Today, utilitarians tell us that speciesism, the view that humans fundamentally matter more than animals, that's an unjust bias. Well, utilitarians were right in the past, they're probably right again today. So that's the track record argument. I've presented this as an argument for utilitarianism. Of course, in principle, we might use the same kind of argument for any moral theory, but I'm going to stick with the argument as an argument for utilitarianism. So, okay, so there's several questions we can ask about this. I mean, the first question, of course, is like, does utilitarianism actually have a better track record than other moral theories? And I suppose there are two issues here. First of all, is it actually true that the early utilitarians tended to hold better moral views than are found in other traditions? So, like, the question here is just, well, what did the early utilitarians, and I suppose non-utilitarians, actually believe? As far as I know, nobody yet has gone through the literature and identified general trends. So, yes, we can cite examples of famous utilitarians, but these examples may well be cherry-picked, and it's a very small sample size. And of course, there are plenty of utilitarians who held morally questionable beliefs. John Stuart Mill was employed by the British East India Company. He argued in favour of colonialism. By contrast, there's plenty of philosophers in different moral traditions who championed bold moral views that we now recognise as correct. So other traditions have been strikingly progressive. Take the Christian Quakers. The Quakers defended many admirable positions. They defended pacifism, slavery abolition, prison reform, equality of the sexes to a fairly great degree. I mean, not perfect, but to a degree that was unprecedented at the time. And they derived these conclusions from their religious ethics and religious commitments rather than from utilitarianism. In fact, the Quakers were founded a century before utilitarianism. So the point of this is just, if we want to defend the track record argument, we're going to need a much more detailed historical analysis. So, you know, that's kind of outside the scope of this video, but that's something we'd have to do, right? So we'd need to take a particular moral position, say slavery abolitionism, look through the literature, see who supported it. We'd have to do that for a wide range of moral views, and then we'd have to do the same thing for a wide range of moral positions in order to start looking at who actually has this good track record. Bear in mind as well that there are likely to be confounding factors here. So here's a possible scenario. Suppose that utilitarianism developed in Britain while Kantianism developed in Germany. And I think that actually is the case, right? The famous Kantian, the famous utilitarians tend to be British, the famous Kantians tend to be German. So, okay, you know, we have like each of these ethical traditions developing in different places. Suppose also that progressive sentiments just happened to be more popular in Britain. Maybe, as you know, a Marxist might say, differences in the material conditions in each country made movements like women's rights more popular in Britain. I mean, I'm not saying that this is true, but if a story like this is correct, then we might think, well, it's not so much that utilitarianism has a good track record, it's just that it developed in the right place at the right time. I mentioned earlier that the Quakers had remarkably progressive views. Quakerism also arose in Britain, again, a century before utilitarianism. So, you know, maybe this kind of general progressive attitude sort of shaped the sentiments of the individual utilitarians, and it kind of shaped their arguments and how they sort of judged the utility calculus. Because, I mean, certainly one can imagine a utilitarian kind of working through the utility calculus and coming to the conclusion that actually slavery is justified because it promotes utility, or actually we're totally justified in, you know, suppressing the rights of women because, again, maybe that somehow promotes utility. One can imagine those sorts of arguments being made. Okay, so yeah, one issue is just we kind of would have to look a bit more closely at the history here. There's a second problem, which is perhaps more serious, and this is that in order to determine the track record of utilitarianism, arguably it's not enough to look at what moral philosophers actually believed. In fact, it's not just that it's not enough, that might not really be probative at all. The reason is that philosophers might be mistaken about what follows from their theories. So, yes, Kant was racist, sexist, he objected to masturbation and so on. It's far less obvious that Kantianism entails racism, sexism, or forbids masturbation. In fact, most philosophers nowadays think that Kantianism is incompatible with many of the views that Kant held. Kant was just mistaken about the commitments of his own theory. Actually, it might be worth noting that later in his life, in his book Perpetual Peace, Kant himself came to reject slavery and colonialism, and he endorsed a much more cosmopolitan attitude, and that was on the basis of his deontological theory, the equal rights and equal respect for all persons. So, like, anyway, like, a lot of people will say, no, like, if you endorse Kantianism, if you endorse this idea that people should be, treated as ends in themselves rather than as mere means, or, like, the right thing to do is whatever you can will as a kind of universal law for the kingdom of ends, then actually we're going to get a theory that condemns racism and sexism and all of this stuff. So a key thing to bear in mind here is that working out what is actually entailed by a moral theory is really difficult. It's not obvious, right, how, we have these like general moral principles. It's not obvious how general principles apply in specific cases. And of course, human beings, well, we make mistakes and we're subject to all sorts of biases. So, of course, we're often going to come to the wrong conclusions about what moral theories say, right? It's going to be very easy, right, to take certain moral principles and then, as a result of your biases, see them as entailing something they don't, right? Like, again, you can easily imagine some person who accepts utilitarianism in principle, but like when they work out the utility calculus, they think that it's just sort of really important for promoting utility that women stay in the house and it's men who go out to work, right? That's that's something you can easily imagine somebody kind of going down that sort of path. And another thing that makes this particularly tricky is that what is entailed by a moral theory can be very sensitive to minor differences in the statement of that theory. So consider the difference between classical utilitarianism and negative utilitarianism. Classical utilitarianism says that the right action is whatever maximizes aggregate pleasure and minimizes aggregate suffering. Negative utilitarianism says the right action is whatever minimizes aggregate suffering, and that's it. Minimization of suffering is given greater priority than maximization of pleasure. So basically, suffering matters more than pleasure, right? It's more important to eradicate suffering than to promote pleasure. Now, that might seem like a fairly minor difference, but it seems to be arguably entailed by negative utilitarianism that it would be good to just destroy the entire world. If you had a button that you could press to immediately eradicate all life, then you ought to press it, because that would eradicate all suffering. So a minor difference in the like moral principle has led to very different first order judgments. Because for a classical utilitarian, eradicating all life would be awful. That would be a terrible thing to do. So, okay, what's the point of this? Well, suppose that some theory, T1, it entails O1, O2, O3. These are bold moral claims, and defenders of the theory explicitly state this, right? They explicitly say, we support slavery abolition, we support women's rights, etc. T2 also entails O1, O2, O3, but defenders of T2 are unaware that it has these commitments. They're wrong about what T2 entails. Later, O1, O2, and O3 become accepted norms. Now the question is, does T1 have a better track record than T2? Or is it that they have the same track record, but we only realised that later? I mean, it seems like if we're judging the track record of a moral theory, what we should be looking at is what that theory entails, not what that theory was believed to entail. And from this point of view, it's not at all clear that utilitarianism scores better than the alternatives, because The alternatives entail what would in the past have been the same moral claims, the same bold moral claims, right? So Kantianism arguably also entails slavery abolition, women's rights, decriminalization of homosexuality, and so on. So that's one issue, right? Like maybe there just isn't really any difference in the track record of these theories. But let's grant that utilitarianism does have a better track record than other moral theories. The next question is, well, would that provide us with a reason to accept utilitarianism? So here's a scenario that might give some intuitive support to this. Suppose I face a moral dilemma. I've been offered a high-paying job at a company that researches weapons. I could really use the money. My family is in a financially difficult situation, dire straits. Now, of course, I feel bad about being involved in weapons research, but I really need the money, and if I don't take the job, somebody else will. It's not actually going to make any difference in the grand scheme of things, whether it's me doing the job or someone else. In fact, maybe if it's me doing the job, I could kind of intentionally do it in a in a less adequate way, right, than if it was somebody who was really zealous about weapons research. So it might actually be better in the grand scheme of things for me to take the job. And maybe I could donate some of my earnings to organizations that promote peace. So, there are reasons to take the job, right? And I'm thinking, should I take the job? So I'm talking with two people, Delia and Ron. Now, suppose that Delia has shown in the past that she makes similar judgments to me. She shares my sentiments. Delia is somebody who's she has kind of anarchistic, sort of libertarian sentiments. She's very socially progressive. She cares about the same sorts of things I care about. She's very much a pacifist. Ron, by contrast, is like a standard Christian conservative. So he has completely different values to me. Delia advises me not to take the job. Ron advises me to take it. And in this situation, I'm probably going to trust Delia's advice. I mean, if I have to trust either of them, if you push me to trust either of them, I say, well, I'll probably go with Delia. Why? Because of her track record. In general, I will be more likely to trust a person's moral judgments if they have a history of making what I regard as the right judgments. Than if they have a history of making what I regard as the wrong judgments, then I'm going to be much less inclined to trust their advice. So similarly, why do we need moral theories? Well, at least part of the answer is to help figure out what to do. Ideally, a moral theory will tell me what is right or wrong in a given situation. When I face a moral dilemma, when I'm unsure about what I ought to do, I can appeal to a moral theory to give me guidance. But which moral theory should I appeal to? Well, if utilitarianism has come to the right answer far more often in the past, that seems like a good reason to trust utilitarianism, just as it was a good reason to trust Delia. So, I suppose that's maybe one way of maybe making this appeal to track records intuitive. So there's a general concern about the track record argument, which is how exactly do I determine who has the best track record? And here we run into a kind of circularity problem. So first of all, let's think about this in the context of other domains. In other domains, very often we have independent criteria that we can use to figure out track records. So let's say that Warris is an engineer who specializes in earthquake protection, and I want to know whether he's trustworthy. Well, I can check that Warris is getting things right in the relevant sense by seeing whether the buildings he designs do in fact resist earthquakes. So in this case, we all agree on what counts as a building that survives an earthquake. Okay, we all sort of have basically the same standard there. And then we can just observe whether a given building survives an earthquake, right? We can just look at places that have had earthquakes and see whether the buildings remain standing. And so this can establish a good track record for the kind of engineer that Warris is. When it comes to morality, things are a bit trickier. So let's say I'm comparing utilitarianism and Kantianism, or I'm comparing two people, Delia and Ron, and I'm asking whose moral judgments are correct. Well, to answer this question, it seems like I can only appeal to my own prior moral views. And there's no general agreement about what the correct moral views are. So, like, if we're judging different engineers, all those engineers and all of us can agree on what counts as an earthquake-resistant building. So, like, we know, right? We know what counts as an earthquake, and then we we know whether or not a building remains standing afterwards. So we all agree on what counts as an earthquake-resistant building. Then we just make observations and see whose buildings meet the agreed standard. There's no such consensus in the moral domain. Like, all I can do is, when assessing Delia and Ron's track record, or Kantianism and Utilitarianism's track record, all I can do is appeal to whatever my own moral views are, but there's no consensus that those moral views are going to be correct. So, when I appeal to my own moral views, I'm going to say, well, Delia has the best track record, so she's the one to trust. But obviously, Ron and other Christian conservatives will just disagree. I mean, given their moral views, they're going to say that Delia has an absolutely terrible track record. Thomas Herrock, in the article I mentioned, raises this objection. So moral theories make predictions about what is actually right or wrong, right? The moral theory is telling us something about what is actually right or wrong. It's not telling us what people will consider to be right or wrong, or even what people in the next few hundred years will consider to be right or wrong. A moral theory tells us what is right and what is wrong. So how do we determine whether or not a moral theory has made the correct predictions? Well, we first need to know what is in fact right or wrong. So, we say that utilitarianism made the correct claim with respect to slavery, right? Utilitarianism says slavery is wrong, and that is the correct judgment about slavery. But in order to know this, we need to know that slavery is indeed morally wrong. How do we know that slavery is morally wrong? Well, Herrick says there are two options here. First of all, the wrongness of slavery might follow from utilitarianism. But obviously, if we're assuming utilitarianism, then of course we will say that utilitarianism made the right predictions. Establishing the track record of utilitarianism in this way is just obviously circular, right? We'd be saying, well, utilitarianism tells us that utilitarianism is correct. Well, yeah, of course it does. So the alternative possibility then is maybe the wrongness of slavery follows from some other non-utilitarian moral theory. Call it M. But if we know that slavery is wrong on the grounds that it follows from M, then we already think that M is correct. And M is a non-utilitarian theory, in which case the track record argument can't justify utilitarianism. Utilitarianism might well have a good track record, but we're only saying it has a good track record because we're saying it came to the right conclusions, and we know those are the right conclusions because we know that M is correct. And if M is correct, utilitarianism is false. So according to Herrock, well, either, when we say that utilitarianism has this great track record, either that's just going to be straightforwardly circular, or it's going to be the case that the judgment that utilitarianism has a good track record follows from a non-utilitarian theory, in which case we're assuming that utilitarianism is false. Either way, the track record argument doesn't work. So what might we say to this? Well, I think there are ways to resist this objection. The assumption that's being made in this dilemma is that moral knowledge must come from some prior commitment to a moral theory. But we might think that there are other ways to arrive at moral knowledge. For instance, we might appeal to intuitions, to common sense, or we might identify potential sources of bias or something like that. So one thing we can do is just notice that there are certain claims that seem to be beyond dispute at this point, like no sensible person is really arguing against them. So for example, no sensible person is arguing that slavery should be reinstated, at least not in our communities, not in the West. I suppose, look, this is obviously arguable. There are some people who will argue for slavery, but we're happy to say, okay, those people are crazy. And then maybe there are situations which are kind of like slavery. So the fact that we fought, so in some places prisoners are forced to work, like maybe that counts as a kind of slavery. But the point is that there really isn't any movement today for reinstating the sort of chattel slavery that existed in the US in the antebellum South, right? So, okay, we can take certain widely accepted moral norms for granted. In claiming that slavery is wrong, I don't need to appeal to any controversial moral theory. So recall the engineer analogy. Everybody agrees on what counts as an earthquake-resistant building. That's how we establish the track record for earthquake engineers. In the same way, everybody agrees on certain moral claims, such as that slavery is wrong. So our current position is this. We don't know exactly which moral theory is right, but we're not completely clueless about morality either. We can use our current limited moral knowledge to make assessments of past moral views, and what we find is that for many of the claims that are now beyond dispute, but that were considered outrageous in the past, the utilitarians got there first. So maybe that avoids Herrick's dilemma. There is, however, a bit of a problem with this approach, which is, I mean, I suppose it raises a problem that we've encountered already. If a moral claim is genuinely beyond dispute, then presumably it must be entailed, or at least it must be thought to be entailed, by all the moral theories that people take seriously. Otherwise, the claim in question would be disputed, right? So, yeah, so like utilitarianism, Kantianism, virtue ethics, contractarianism, and so on, all of these are taken to condemn slavery. And notice that if they weren't, right, like if it were the case that there's like just loads of Kantians, loads of virtue ethicists, loads of contractarians going around saying that actually slavery is acceptable, then it wouldn't be beyond dispute. So the point is that what we would say now is people in the past who accepted these theories but endorsed slavery were wrong about what these theories entailed. So the point is, if we try to establish the track record of moral theories by using moral claims that are beyond dispute, then it's going to turn out that all theories have the same track records. So nothing favours utilitarianism. Well, that's the objection anyway. Okay, well, that's all I wanted to talk about. As I said, not a lot of literature on this argument, but I thought it might make for an interesting video, and that's all I have to say. So, thanks for watching.